Well, I understand the province has some financial stresses and strains that obviously impact on their ability to do things. I started today by mentioning there are some things that are contained in this report that they could do that will make a positive difference for us in terms of trying to fix this model and get on with the job we have to do. I have raised, I won't say it's been in every single meeting, but I would be probably not far off this matter with the Premier when we've been having our regular meetings to discuss issues that are of profound concern to the City of Toronto. I mean, obviously, I raised the transportation issue and the housing issue with her on many, many occasions, and she's aware of the need we have to address the backlog. But I'm gratified at the fact that I think help is on the way for sure, because it's been said, I think, in pretty direct terms by the Government of Canada, and we'll continue to work with the province, maybe starting with these regulatory changes and getting on to the inescapable fact that they have to help us financially as well. I won't. I wasn't meaning to suggest there's some that I automatically reject. I'm simply trying to avoid, with respectfully, any of you or your colleagues saying to me later, you said you'd endorse and implement every single one of those recommendations. I think that this report, the general framework that it represents, the thrust of what it wants to do with decentralized management, with a big push to increase supply, with new partnerships that we're going to form with others, with a status for this corporation that puts it in a kind of more depoliticized kind of mode where it can sort of get things done to increase the supply and address the way it operates itself. I think these are things that I can get behind, and I do. I just didn't want to put myself in a position where I was sort of, you're saying, well, recommendation 12. I think most of them are things that I think are in the kind of heading in the kind of direction that we need to take to fundamentally reform this corporation. Yes, Sue Ann. I will say to you in all honesty that since I've been here, I've come to realize this is one of the big challenges that confronts all governments, but I'm only worried about this one. It confronts municipal government here in the City of Toronto. You create these arm's length organizations which are designed to be one step removed so that they can kind of make decisions about their own future and their own area of expertise. And then, politicians, have their hands in, sometimes I would say not even up to the elbows, but up to the shoulders on day-to-day things, on even problems that are 5 levels below the Board of Directors. Having city councillors on the Board of Directors, I'm not saying by getting behind, and I would get behind the recommendation that we have a Board of Directors that consists of citizens, and that the councillors can play, I believe, a much more effective role actually affecting positively the lives of people at the lower level, but I think at the neighborhood level. But I think that the problem with these corporations in the past has been that they haven't been allowed to be autonomous, and that the politicians, and I am one, so I'm not trying to speak about some group that is sort of off somewhere else, but politicians have been too inclined to want to get involved in the day-to-day affairs. And I think if you look, and that's why I tried to draw attention, Sue Ann, to the experience we've had with the other nonprofit housing providers. If you look at the other 240, not 2, not 24, 240 nonprofit housing providers, admittedly smaller than this very large one, and look at the degree to which they managed to avoid a lot of this controversy, they managed to avoid a lot of the kind of hands in it up to the elbows involvement of political representatives, I think it represents a better model for us to be able to create the autonomy, but also the accountability and the effectiveness at dealing with the problems. And so to me, that's why I think this model will be better than the model that we've seen. I'll speak only to Toronto Community Housing, and maybe I'll ask the Senator to comment. I'm not going to get into either of those, but they're very different examples. I mean, one is a sort of a charitable. And I will tell you what I would choose to use as my example, and it's the third time I've mentioned it, but I mean, because I think it is a model for us in this field, proving it can be done, which is 240 non-profit housing providers, and I'm not saying they're all perfect, but I am saying that if you look at their general experience, how much you read about them, how much you write about them, in terms of the kinds of controversies you're referring to that have existed, I admit that, I would say they have done a pretty good job of being effective, of being autonomous, and of addressing problems in individual neighborhoods and communities, and providing good service to people, which I think is in the end what we want to do here. Ms. Levy asked that you answer the question as well.
First and foremost, in all of our consideration, we asked ourselves on all of our recommendations, how does this improve the living conditions of the residents of TCHC? How does this give them more self-determination? How does this get them better involved in the day-to-day management of their facilities? And our recommendations, if you look at the cross-section of them, together can accomplish that. We create a more customer service culture. We need to do that. We've had an organization which combines both development, has different kinds of expertise in one area and different kinds of expertise in the area of actually managing social housing. We need to have a very complete focus on the operations end of this portfolio on a customer service orientation. We need to have tenant advisory committees, not just people who one or two get elected from a particular building, but people in the community who have an interest in the community coming together, tenant advisory committees, working with the city council, working with the city, trying to improve the living conditions, and most important, working with the frontline staff. We need a flatter organization. We need an organization that we have more people in the field getting to understand the day-to-day needs of the people that they are working for and with. So decentralization will help to bring a lot of that about. The board itself, in terms of the construction of the board, I agree with the mayor. It should be more distant from the political arena. The 240 nonprofits in Toronto work quite well without city council as far as I know. Most of them or none of them have city council representation, but they work quite well by people who care about their communities, many of whom are tenants. And our board should be people with different skill sets, different experiences, including people with lived experience as part of that overall picture. Just out of interest, the New York Housing Authority, which is 3 times bigger than this one, has no politicians on its board. So we think this can work better. It can work quite well. One of the problems that has existed in terms of the board from my interviews of previous board members is that they were always looking over their shoulder as to whether or not the management was responding to them or responding to city council, the city administration, or whatever. There was this compromise, some of them felt, to the fiduciary responsibility that they had. So there should be no confusion about that. There should be very clearly a board given the mandate. There's some good board people that have now been appointed, I might add. But at the same time, we need to make this organization work better for the tenants.
Why don't we deal with them one at a time? I will say to you right now, this is not about people losing their housing as we change a ratio or change a regulation with respect to rent to income. What it is about is indicating the recognition of the fact that the model, as the Senator I think so well put it, that has 90% of the people in many of these buildings across the portfolio being rent geared to income tenants and not a mixed community, doesn't work financially, and I would argue, and I think he said the same thing, it doesn't work socially. And so if we set as an objective to have the province, first of all, permit us to be able to accommodate a different model that has more of a mixed community, we will also at the same time have to address the question of whether if we gave them a rent subsidy or some kind of housing allowance, there was somewhere to take it. And obviously that depends on things we know, which are vacancy rates and so on. And as I said, fundamental to all of this is increasing the supply. And so we're taking measures now through open doors and otherwise to increase the supply. I realize that our progress so far has been in small increments, but they are making a difference, and we're doing better than we were doing before, and I'm determined to do much better. But I acknowledge again that I'm going to need the help of the other governments to substantially increase supply and to be able to do some things that are bigger and bolder to increase that supply, so as to both make sure we have places for all of these individuals to live, these families, and to make sure we can start to make some progress on the waiting list. Well, I mean, yes, you're not going to do every building at once, but the bottom line is before you can make an apartment something that is subject to a higher rent you do. And that's why there's an urgency to that, among many other reasons, not the least of which, of course, is the people who live there already. I think we've taken the decision in some areas like Lawrence Heights, like Regent Park, and I think there should be other areas where you have to call into question just the soundness of the financial decision you would make to repair these buildings where they're in such a bad state that you'd be better off to demolish and renew those communities. And so I think the report suggests in its wording that we have to go through and take a case-by-case look at every piece of property we have, and that's the responsible thing to do, and make decisions. And, you know, some of these things I know are controversial, but I'm not going to shy away from that, because in the end, what I'm here to do is to do the right thing, to fix this model. 30 years. There are people who will have various things to say about this report today, and you know what? No solution that's proposed by anybody, including me or Senator Eggleton, is perfect, but there are some of the people who will be critical of this who have been here for much of those 30 years, and the situation has gone downhill and downhill and downhill, so that how did a $2.6 billion repair backlog arise in the first place? And I'm saying part of it was because the other governments of probably various political parties over time didn't step up and deal with it. But I think we've got to look at this now with very clear eyes and with you know, no sacred cows in terms of things where we're just going to say, look, we're going to make the right decisions to address fixing up the current buildings, fixing up, as Senator Eggleton said, first and foremost, the living conditions of people who live there, trying to put this on a better model going forward so that the finances will not deteriorate further, and increasing the supply. We had an interesting exchange between Councillor Bilow and Minister Sohi when he was here for the first meeting, which led to the second one, and he asked the same question. He said, well, how soon could you get me you know, some projects that we could get to work on? Because the federal government quite rightly has a desire not only to invest in this kind of infrastructure, but also to get people to work on these kinds of projects in uncertain economic times. And Councillor Bilow said to him, I have a file right here that has tender documents in it. I could slide them across the table to you right now. I mean, I think that's a small exaggeration, but I think the bottom line is, because this has been festering for so long, if there's any good news at all out of that, it is that we know where we would go with money to come from both the federal and provincial governments. And by the way, I have reasons to be optimistic that there's going to be some financial assistance coming forward from the provincial government. I'm not sure it'll be in the same quantity as yet as the federal government, and we have projects ready to go. I mean, they're ready to go. Think about something like energy retrofits, for example, you know, where that's not going to solve the entire problem of these buildings, but it's going to be a great start in that it will improve. I mean, one of the big issues that we're putting more than $1 million to in the budget this year is fixing this problem where some people face huge disparities in the heating bills that they get, some of our poorest citizens. And we've got $1 million to try to address that. But really what we have to do as well is address the fact that we're spending millions of dollars on trying to effectively heat the outdoors, because these buildings are so in bad shape that the heat is just going out through the windows and through the ceilings and the roofs. And so energy retrofits, I think, is something that both governments, given their expressed concern about climate change, can help us with. And there are other projects as well that we can get on with as soon as we had the money.
I understand you have some ready to go. How long do you envision for everything to be finished? Are we talking years? Are we talking a decade? Like, how long are we talking?
Well, I don't think it can take a decade. In other words, I don't think we can afford a decade. I mean, we've already indicated some of these buildings are going to have to be closed if we don't get them fixed a lot sooner than a decade. So I can only assure you that as soon as we have the resources, and we're going to try and look at maximizing our own resources, we've already put, I remind people, $800 million up through various refinancings and so on. I have moved forward to say that I would support the creation of a city building fund, which was expressly created to help with housing and transit. I suggested a modest first step in terms of how we could begin to finance that with the open invitation to continue